I never thought I'd be the kind of person to stand in front of a locked valve. Heart pounding, hand hovering over the wheel, knowing exactly what turning it would do. But after what the HOA did to my property, I wasn't going to let it slide. See, a few months ago, I built a small barn on the edge of my land. Nothing flashy, just a clean, practical structure for my tools and a few animals. It was all within my rights, or so I thought. But one morning, I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery and voices shouting over the hum of an engine. By the time I made it outside, it was already too late. My barn, the one I built with my own hands, was being torn down. Turns out, the HOA decided my barn violated community aesthetics, even though it sat well within my property lines and wasn't visible from the road. No notice, no warning. Just a demolition order and a smug letter explaining how they were preserving neighborhood harmony. I was furious. I tried to reason with them, even offered to repaint it or move a few things around, but they wouldn't budge. They said the decision was final, and if I rebuilt, I'd face daily fines. Now, here's where things get interesting. What the HOA didn't know, or maybe forgot, is that there's an old dam valve that sits just behind my property. It feeds water directly into the lake next to the HOA's prized resort area, the same lake they brag about in every brochure and real estate listing. And guess who owns that tiny strip of land with the valve on it? Me. I'd always maintained it quietly, never thought twice about it. Until now, so I stood there, staring at the valve, thinking about the barn, the wasted hours, the disrespect. And that's when I decided, if they could take something from me without warning, maybe. It was time they felt what that was like too. What happened next? Well, let's just say the water levels started changing. Fast. The funny thing is, we never really paid much attention to that valve until all this started. My grandfather used to talk about it when I was a kid, said it was part of the original irrigation system. From way back when, this land was mostly farmland. Most folks around here didn't even know it existed, tucked behind some trees and brush on a patch of land that didn't look like much, but it connects straight to the small dam that regulates water flow into the resort lake. And once I started looking into it more, I found the deed that narrow sliver of land with the valve was still in my family's name, not under the HOA's control, not even in their jurisdiction. That's when the idea started forming. After they tore down my barn, I spent days going through old documents, maps, anything I could find. I wasn't sure what I'd do at first. I mean, I'm not the kind of guy who causes problems. I've lived here for years, paid my dues, kept to myself. But watching them destroy something I built without even a proper discussion flipped a switch in me. And the more I looked into how the HOA operated, all the hidden rules, the vague terms they throw around, the more it felt like they were running a private kingdom. One where they could just pick and choose who followed which rules. Meanwhile, the resort lake was still the centerpiece of their little empire. Fancy walking trails, paddle boats, weekend concerts. They kept that lake pristine like it was holy ground. And now, I had a direct link to it, one they had completely ignored. I didn't do anything rash right away. I walked that trail a few times just to see how many folks actually knew what fed that lake. Not a single sign. Not a single mention of where the water came from. Just smiling families. HOA board members sipping coffee on the dock, like everything was under their control, but it wasn't. Not entirely. And that's when I realized, maybe they'd built their perfect little world on something a lot more fragile than they thought. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about a barn. It was about power. The HOA had been tightening their grip on this community for years. They started with the usual things: grass too long, mailbox not painted the right shade of beige, but over time it got worse. Fines for wind chimes, threats over garden gnomes. One neighbor got written up for having his truck parked in his own driveway too often. It all started to feel less like community upkeep and more like control for control's sake. And now they'd set their sights on me. I started hearing whispers from other neighbors, two people who didn't want to speak up, afraid of retaliation. One guy down the street told me they made him tear down a shed that had been there for 10 years. Another woman said they rejected her fence 3 times over color inconsistency, even though it matched every house on the block. These weren't just one-offs. This was a pattern, a quiet war. And most people were too tired or intimidated to push back. Meanwhile, I kept checking the lake. Subtle changes started showing muddy patches near the edges, the waterline just a hair lower. Nothing anyone would panic over, yet. But I knew the system well enough to understand what a small adjustment at the valve could do over time. And the fact that no one had noticed proved one thing. They were asleep at the wheel. Too confident in their control. I still hadn't turned the valve fully, just eased it down, little by little, watching how the ecosystem responded. At the same time, I began gathering proof photos, dates, even drone footage showing my barn before and after the demolition. I wasn't just going to sit back and watch them pretend this was business as usual. I wanted a record. Something that showed the HOA didn't just make a bad call. They abused their power. But the question kept nagging at me. How far was I really willing to go? Because if things kept unfolding the way they were, I knew this wouldn't end with just a drop in the water. This was going to get a whole lot messier. By the end of that week, the tension in the neighborhood was thick enough to feel. A few people started asking questions about the lake, why the docks looked slightly off-level, why the shoreline plants were starting to dry out. Nothing major yet, but enough that the HOA sent out one of their all-caps community updates, blaming a dry spell. Thing is, we hadn't had a real dry spell. It had rained 3 days earlier. That's when I knew they were starting to squirm, just a little. Behind the scenes, I was still collecting everything I could, shown shots of the shrinking lake, records of the HOA's letters, photos of the barn site. I even found the original community bylaws, the ones the HOA didn't like to mention much anymore. There it was, in black and white, clear limits to what they could enforce, and more importantly, proof that the barn hadn't broken any actual codes. They'd overstepped, but that wouldn't matter unless I brought it all out into the open. And to do that, I needed one final push, something they couldn't ignore. I started getting mysterious calls, too. No caller ID, a voice asking questions like, "You planning on stirring things up? And wouldn't it be easier to just move on?" Always calm, always polite, but with an edge that didn't feel right. I never answered directly, but I knew someone on the HOA board must have figured out I had leveraged on. They didn't like it one bit. They were trying to scare me into silence. It only made me more sure I was on the right path. Then came the HOA meeting. They held it in the lakeside clubhouse, like always, acting like everything was normal. But I'd already noticed the pumps running longer than usual. They were desperately trying to balance the water level. I showed up unannounced, walked right through the crowd with a folder in one hand and a printed aerial photo in the other. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. I didn't say a word. I just laid the photo on the table in front of the bored half-drained shoreline. Exposed silt, the valve just barely visible in the background. For the first time, they looked rattled. Just as I expected, the HOA board scrambled to regain control of the room. One of them, Jim, the treasurer, always the loudest voice in the room, stood up and tried to brush it all off. "This photo doesn't prove anything," he said, waving a hand like he was shooing a fly. "That shoreline erosion is natural, happens every few years." But I could see the nervous glances they were giving each other. They knew. And now, they knew I knew. That should have been enough to tip the scales. But what I didn't see coming was what they did next. 2 days later, I got a letter. Not a standard HOA notice, this one came from the county office. According to the document, a new environmental review had been triggered. They were launching an investigation into land use and potential tampering with public water infrastructure. At first, I thought it was just a scare tactic. But then, I realized the county seal was real. They weren't bluffing. Someone on the HOA had pulled a string, probably called in a favor. And suddenly, I wasn't just a guy with a grudge, was the subject of a formal inquiry. The kicker, the dam valve system, the one I owned the land around, had never been fully updated in the county records. It was legally mine, yes, but the infrastructure itself hadn't been maintained by the county or any official agency in years. That left a gray area big enough for the HOA to exploit. And now they were spinning it, trying to paint me as the threat, the one endangering the delicate ecosystem of their lake. The same lake they used to host paddleboat parties and fireworks shows all summer. Neighbors started backing off. People who used to wave now looked the other way. A few even whispered that I'd gone too far. And just like that, the story was shifting. The HOA wasn't on trial anymore, I was. But I still had one card left to play. One piece of the puzzle they hadn't seen yet. The part of the lake